Part 1. The English Channel looked nothing like an invasion route on the night of June 4th, 1944. The waves were running 5 feet, the wind was tearing whitecaps off the surface and driving rain sideways across the Norman coast. In the concrete fortifications that lined the cliffs and beaches from Cherbourg to Cannes, German soldiers listened to the storm and felt, despite everything, a small measure of relief. No army was crossing that. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel agreed. He had studied the weather reports. He had spoken to the meteorologists at Army Group B. The forecast was unambiguous. The channel would remain hostile to any large-scale landing for at least several more days. What he needed was not to stand at his desk and watch the storm. What he needed was to be in Bavaria, standing across a table from Adolf Hitler, making the argument one more time. He needed more Panzer divisions near the coast. He had been making this argument for months. He was going to make it again, this time in person, because there are things that telephone calls cannot convey and maps cannot capture. He needed Hitler to understand what Rommel had seen in Africa, what the desert had taught him about air power and armor, and the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. That argument required his physical presence. The storm made the timing feel safe. He packed carefully in his bag went the documents he would need, and separately wrapped in the kind of paper you use for a birthday gift, a box of shoes. His wife, Lucie's birthday was June 6th. He had found them in Paris, exactly what she had described. Wanting. He was not a sentimental man, not outwardly, but he had remembered he carried them in the car because he was going home first to Herlingen before continuing on to see the Führer. He was a general preparing for an important meeting with a gift for his wife in the back seat of his car. Driving away from the coast, he was responsible for defending, certain that he had time. Here is what made that certainty catastrophic. Rommel was not careless, he was not negligent. He had built the entire defensive logic of the Atlantic Wall on a single, furiously argued premise. The invasion would be decided in its first hours, not in a grand armored counterstrike days later, not in some strategic masterstroke executed from depth, on the beaches, in the water, while Allied soldiers were still fighting the surf. The Germans would have one moment to destroy the invasion before it became permanent. And that moment would pass so quickly that no reserves, however powerful, positioned days inland, could reach the coast in time. He had said this so many times to so many skeptical generals that his staff could recite it from memory. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. He believed it completely. He had staked the entire logic of his defensive strategy on it. And then he drove away from the coast because the meteorologists said so, because the storm said so, because the best intelligence available to German high command said the weather window was closed. What German intelligence did not know was that on the other side of the channel, a Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg was staring at the same storm and seeing something different. He had been tracking a pattern of pressure systems moving across the North Atlantic, and he had found something in that pattern the German forecasters had missed entirely. A gap, not a long one. 36 hours, perhaps 40. Brief, imperfect window of calmer weather opening between two systems, too short for any planner with options to consider usable. Stagg brought his findings to General Eisenhower on the evening of June 4th. The Germans and the Allies had access to the same weather data, the same ocean, the same sky, and they reached opposite conclusions about what it meant. One side found the gap, one side didn't. Rommel's car moved south, away from the coast, carrying the man who had understood the stakes better than anyone, carrying a gift wrapped in paper for a birthday that was 2 days away. He was going to miss it. The argument that had been consuming the German military command for months was not a dispute between capable men and incompetent men. It was a collision between two different understandings of how war had changed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had been a soldier for 50 years. He was 68 years old. He was the Commander-in-Chief West, the senior German military authority in France, the inheritor of a Prussian tradition so old and so deep it had shaped his thinking down to the bone. He had watched Germany crush France in 1940 with an armored doctrine that had seemed like prophecy. Hold the reserve, wait for the enemy to commit, then strike with everything you have in a single, concentrated blow. Let the Allies land, he argued. Let them stretch their supply lines. Let them commit to defending a narrow strip of French coastline, then drive into them before they can be reinforced. One massive strike, one decisive engagement. The book. Rommel had come from a different school. His school was the Libyan desert, and the tuition had been the destruction of an entire army. He had watched the Afrika Korps, masters of armored maneuver, some of the finest tank soldiers in the world, get systematically obliterated by an enemy that owned the sky. He had watched his columns burn on open roads in daylight, watched the fighter bombers come in low and leave behind metal that was still smoking. Days later, he had learned what no training manual had yet incorporated. But in a war where the enemy controls the air, an armored column moving in daylight is not a strategic weapon. It is a queue of targets waiting to be destroyed. Von Rundstedt's plan assumed that German panzer divisions could drive hundreds of kilometers from their inland positions to the coast and arrive intact. Rommel knew they would never make it. He had seen what Allied aircraft did to things that moved on roads. Neither man had the authority to resolve the argument himself, so they brought it to Hitler. And Hitler, with the characteristic genius for compromise that marked his military decisions until the end, gave each of them half of what they wanted and neither what they needed. Rommel received direct control of 3 panzer divisions positioned near the coast. The 4 most powerful armored divisions in France were designated as a central reserve. Under neither Rommel's command nor von Rundstedt, their release required one person's authorization, Hitler himself, from Bavaria. In a battle where every minute would matter, the German chain of command had been arranged to guarantee delay measured in hours. The house was divided before the first shot. On the night of June 5th, General Erich Marx sat at a table in his headquarters near Saint-Lô and opened a bottle of wine with a small number of his staff. It was the eve of his 53rd birthday. He was a compact, deliberate man who had lost his right leg to a Soviet artillery shell on the Eastern Front in 1941 and walked on a wooden prosthetic ever since, with the unhurried gait of someone who has made peace with the fact that the body finds new ways to carry itself forward. He was one of the sharpest operational minds in the German army, and his command, the L6 Civvy Corps, held the coastal sector that included the beaches the Allies would later call Utah and Omaha. There was nothing extravagant about the gathering. A few glasses, a few officers who respected him and knew him well enough to sit with him on a quiet evening. The wine was Norman, which was something what no one mentioned, perhaps because it was the kind of thing you don't say out loud in the weeks before a battle you expect to survive, was what had happened in early May in a room not far from where they were sitting. The staff of the 7th Army had conducted a map exercise, a Kriegspiel, a command-level simulation. The scenarios Allied forces execute a large-scale amphibious landing along the Normandy coast in early June. German commanders play out their responses. Counterattacks are simulated. Reserves are moved. The results are documented and studied. Germany lost the exercise now. It was the night of June 5th. His birthday was tomorrow, June 6th. The reports from the coast were quiet. The storm was violent enough to feel almost like safety. At 1:11 in the morning, the telephone rang. Paratroopers, said the duty officer. Reports of paratroopers, not in one location, everywhere. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, Sainte-Mère-Église, east of the Via, north of Carentan. Scattered, contradictory, impossible to map into any coherent operational picture. Marx put down his glass and moved to the maps. The wooden prosthetic made its familiar sound on the floor. He spread the reports out and looked at them and tried to make them tell him something they refused to say cleanly. The scatter pattern could mean one of two things: the genuine chaos of a large airborne landing blown off course by the storm, or a deliberate performance designed to look exactly like that while the real blow fell somewhere else. German intelligence had been certain for months that the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrow point, the logical choice. He could not move his only armored reserve towards shadows in the dark, not if this was a diversion, not if the real blow was still coming. He looked at the map, he waited part 2. Across the Norman countryside, in the fields and orchards and farmyards that lay between the coast and the inland roads, this most elaborate deception in the history of warfare was working exactly as intended. The British had given it the name Operation Titanic. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. Before the real paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended on their objectives, Royal Air Force aircraft flew low over a wide swath of Normandy and released what looked, from below, like a wave of airborne soldiers. Hundreds of figures drifting down through the darkness on parachutes. They were not soldiers, they were dummies, burlap and wire, shaped into the rough silhouette of a man in a parachute harness. Each one fitted with a small explosive charge designed to detonate on impact and produce a sound that in the dark, in the confusion, on a night when every noise carried its own interpretation, was convincingly similar to the crack of rifles and the pop of small arms. The British called them Ruperts. At the same time, a separate formation of aircraft flew a precise, calculated course over the channel toward Pas de Calais, releasing bundles of aluminum foil strips at specific intervals and altitudes. On German radar screens, those strips resolved into a picture identical to a large naval fleet approaching the coast. This was Operation Taxable, a ghost armada made of metal confetti sailing toward a beach that no invasion would ever touch. The real paratroopers were in the air as well, fighting the wind and the darkness and the flak. Many of them dropped miles from their intended zones. Some landed in the flooded marshes of the Cotentin and drowned in 3 feet of water under the weight of their equipment. Others came down alone in orchards and moved in the dark toward objectives they could not yet locate, navigating a country they had memorized from maps but never walked. In German headquarters across the region, the reports described a battle that did not exist, fought by soldiers who were never there. Infantry units were dispatched into empty fields. Officers spent hours coordinating responses to engagements that had already ceased to be anything at all. The signal traffic was a controlled fire of false information, and the men responsible for interpreting it were working under pressure, with telephone lines that were already beginning to fail, in a darkness full of things that were not what they appeared to be. Marx stood at his map table and watched the chaos accumulate. He had placed his corps on alert, he had notified the 352nd Infantry Division and the 716th. He had done what could be done with the information available. But the one thing he needed, the thing that would transform his ability to respond to any of this, was armor. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned inland, and its movement to the coast required authorization that Marx did not possess. Picked up the telephone. His call went first to Lieutenant General Max Pemsel, the Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, who was awake and alert and immediately troubled. Pemsel agreed the situation was serious, but Pemsel did not have authority to release armored reserve. The request moved to General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army. Dollmann was not at his headquarters, he was on the road. On the morning of June 6th, the divisional commanders of the 7th Army had been called to the city of Rennes, approximately 200 kilometers south of the invasion coast. The occasion was a Kriegspiel, a command-level map exercise. The scenario: Allied forces execute an amphibious landing in Normandy. The senior officers responsible for defending those exact beaches were in their staff cars, driving south through the French night, on their way to practice a simulation of what was already beginning without them. The orders to cancel the exercise would not reach many of them in time to matter. The request climbed upward anyway, through the 7th Army staff, to Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris. Von Rundstedt agreed. The reports from Normandy appeared significant. He requested that OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, release the armored reserve. The request reached the desk of General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German Supreme Command. Jodl read the reports. He understood what they described. He had the authority to wake the Führer. He also understood what waking the Führer with information that subsequently proved to be a false alarm would mean for a man of his standing and his career. He made his calculation. He let Hitler sleep. In central France, at the headquarters of the Panzer Division, General Fritz Bayerlein sat by his telephone and watched the hours disappear. Bayerlein had served under Rommel in North Africa. He had seen what happened when armor arrived late to a battle already decided. He was calling anyone who would answer. He was asking for permission to. His tanks sat in their hard stands with their engines cold, their crews standing beside them in the early darkness, listening to the distant sound of naval gunfire, trying to understand why the order wasn't coming. It wasn't coming because one general in Bavaria had weighed the risk to his reputation against the risk to Normandy, and Normandy had lost. The armored reserves that Rommel had argued for 2 years needed to be at the coast, within hours sat idle across France. And in the grey of the approaching dawn, the largest naval force ever assembled in human history moved into position. Major Werner Pluskat was an artillery officer stationed at an observation post above the beach the Allies had designated Omaha. He was there before first light, which was his habit, pressing his eye to a powerful optical rangefinder, the routine of horizon. The routine to check the empty channel, the nothing that was always there. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, he looked out at the sea and could not find the horizon. Where the line between ocean and sky should have been, there was steel. Ship hulls, one after another, running from left to right across the entire field of vision. He rotated the instrument to the left, looking for the edge of the formation. There was no edge. He rotated to the right. No edge there either. He lifted his face from the eyepiece and looked with his naked eyes, and the impression was unchanged. It was not a fleet. It was not something that had a beginning and an end. It was a city of steel that had materialized on the surface of the channel overnight and was now, in the growing light, moving toward him. He picked up the telephone and spoke in a voice that had gone flat with the particular calm of a man confronting something his mind had no category for. There is a naval force out here that extends from one side of my rangefinder to the other. I cannot find the edges. It looks like a city. The officer at the other end of the line told him he was exaggerating. He was not exaggerating. At 5:50 in the morning, the fleet opened fire. 16 battleships, dozens of cruisers, more than 100 destroyers. The combined weight of metal they threw at the Normandy coast in the next 40 minutes had no precedent in the history of naval bombardment. Inside the concrete fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, the world inverted. The shells arrive before the sound of the guns, which is the first indication that the force you are facing is operating at a scale your experience cannot process. The ground under the bunkers moved. Men were thrown from their feet. Concrete dust filled the air. The telephone lines died in the first minutes. The field radios became useless in the electromagnetic violence of the bombardment. The Atlantic Wall, designed as an interconnected defensive network where each position supported the ones beside it, its multi-unitness systems, was being dismantled and each fortification became an island. Cut off, blind, unable to coordinate with the positions on either side, unable to call for the artillery support that was supposed to come, unable to do anything except hold on to what could be held and wait for whatever came next. The bombardment lasted until 6:30, then the landing craft appeared. They came out of the smoke and the early light in long lines, their flat bows pushing through the residual chop of the storm. Loaded with men standing in the water, sloshing at the hull bottom, holding weapons above the waterline, looking toward a beach they could not yet see clearly. The 1st American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division were approaching the sand at Omaha, a beach that had been prepared and fortified and manned for months, and which was now, in the first minutes of contact, demanding everything from everyone on it. In the fortification called Wider Stand's Nest 62, positioned on a bluff overlooking the center of that beach, a soldier named Heinrich Sevelow was at his post. He was 18 years old. He had grown up on a farm in Lower Saxony. He had raised cattle. He had done the things farm boys do in the years before a government decides what they will do instead. He had been in this position for months, watching the empty channel in every kind of weather. The channel was not empty now. Sevelow settled behind his MG-42 machine gun. The weapon fired 1,200 rounds per minute. He had trained on it until the operation was reflexive, something the hands did while the mind was somewhere slightly above and behind, observing. He acquired targets with the systematic deliberateness of someone who has been taught a craft and practiced it until it became second nature. For hours in his sector, he was devastatingly effective. The fire from WN-62 was the central defining fact of what happened to the men who tried to cross the 200 yards of open sand below his position. They fell in the water, they fell on the ramps of the landing craft, they fell at the wire. The geometry of the position had been calculated for exactly this. The sightlines measured and set before the first American ship left England with fields of fire designed to create a zone where nothing could survive movement, and still the Americans came. That was the thing Sevelow would describe 40 years later in a memoir written with the honest precision of a man who has spent decades living with a memory he cannot change, as the moment his understanding of what he was participating in underwent a permanent shift. Not the violence itself, not the noise or the fear, the mathematics. For every man who fell to his fire, there were more behind him. For every landing craft, his fire swept from one end to the other, 3 more appeared behind it, lowered their ramps, and put more men into the surf. He could not find an end to them. He was not fighting a military unit with a fixed strength that could be attrited below the threshold of function. He was fighting a process, a continuous production of soldiers from an apparently inexhaustible source somewhere beyond the visible horizon. And no matter what he did, the beach below him was fuller than it had been an hour before. He fired more than 12,000 rounds that day. By the time the afternoon came, what had run out was not his ammunition. It was the specific professional belief instilled by training and confirmed across 5 years of war that accurate defensive fire breaks an attacking force, stops its momentum, defeats its will. That belief had not survived contact with what he was watching. The tide does not stop because you are standing in it. While Sevelow fired and the American infantry died on the sand below him, and slowly, at a cost that was terrible to witness even from the position of the man inflicting it, began to find the gaps in the wire and the draws through the bluffs. A different effort was taking shape inland. The 21st Panzer Division had received authorization to move, not the full release of the OKW reserve, that was still trapped in Bavaria. But Rommel, anticipating months earlier that normal channels might fail at exactly the wrong moment, had embedded a pre-planned defensive mission into the 21st Standing Orders. It was a partial measure. It was something. The tanks that should have been at the coast before dawn were now moving toward it in the early afternoon. Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronickowski commanded the armored battle group leading the advance. He was 45 years old. In another life, 8 years earlier, he had stood on a podium in Berlin with a gold medal around his neck, the best equestrian competitor in the world at the 1936 Olympic Games. He had been a soldier his entire adult life, and he understood, stopped in the way experienced soldiers understand things without being told exactly how late it was and what that lateness meant. He pushed his battle group through the Norman countryside with the focus of a man trying to recover hours that were already gone. The roads were deteriorating, refugees moving south away from the coast, destroyed vehicles on the verges, the visible evidence of a defensive system that had been tested this morning and found to be exactly what Rommel had said it was. Thin, inadequate, real only in the parts made of concrete. By mid-afternoon, the lead elements of his battle group reached the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer, in the gap between the British landing zones of Sword and Juno. He could see the water. The English Channel, grey in the afternoon light, stretching north toward England. His tanks had reached it. For a span of 1 hour, Rommel's was not a theory debated in conference rooms by men who disagreed about things they couldn't prove. It was a physical fact. Armour at the beachhead split, the British landing zones separated from each other. Then the sky came down on them. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagbomber, fighter bombers. The word had accumulated over years of fighting under Allied air power, a specific weight of dread that no other word in the German military vocabulary quite matched. Royal Air Force Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts coming in from altitude with rockets and bombs, hunting everything that moved on the roads below, operating with a precision that came from months of practice on exactly this target type. The Panzer crews had no answer. Their main guns could not track aircraft. Their machine guns would not stop what was coming. The planes came anyway, and the tanks that had fought through the chaos of the Norman countryside to reach the coast, that had for 1 hour demonstrated that everything Rommel had argued was correct, began to burn. Not from British infantry, not from British anti-tank guns, from the sky. The lesson that had cost Rommel an entire army in North Africa was being taught again in one afternoon at the cost of the only armoured formation that had gotten close enough to the coast to matter to Adolf. By evening, von Oppeln-Bronichowski was pulling back. The coastline was no longer reachable. The British beachhead was consolidating behind him. The sky had decided there had been 1 hour. One precise, costly, hard 1 hour on the afternoon of June 6th, 1944, when the tanks were at the beach and the doctrine was working, and the argument that had divided German command for months was being proven correct in the physical language of steel and fire. The man who had made that argument was not there to see it. He had been on a road in Germany, moving in the wrong direction for 2 days. 43, Rommel's car reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon at 9 in the evening. He had been on the road since morning. The call had come at 10:15, reaching him still in Herlingen, and he had told his driver to turn around without finishing the sentence. He spent the hours that followed in the back seat with the field radio, receiving the picture as it assembled itself, report by report, with the particular anguish of a man who can see exactly what each piece means and cannot change any of it. There is a specific quality to understanding a disaster in real time from a distance. It is unlike any other form of helplessness. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was waiting in the operations room. The briefing was precise and short and contained nothing that could be called a surprise. 5 beaches. All penetrated, the Allied line on the coast was no longer a collection of contested positions. It was a continuous front, reinforced throughout the day, deepening as the evening advanced. The OKW reserve, the Panzer divisions locked in Bavaria behind Hitler's personal authorization, had been released at 3:30 in the afternoon, 7 hours after the first naval shell landed on the Normandy coast. The lead elements would not reach the battle area until tomorrow, moving carefully at night because the roads in daylight now belonged to the aircraft above. Rommel stood in front of the map table. The shoes he had bought in Paris were still in his car, still wrapped, still with the tag that said who they were for and what day they were meant for. That day had come and gone. He had not been home for his wife's birthday. He had not been at his command when the invasion came. He had been in a car, moving through the wrong country on the day he had spent 2 years preparing for, on the day he had said more time than could be counted would determine everything. He was in the operations room now, looking at a map that confirmed every prediction he had ever made and none of the outcomes he had hoped for. He did not speak for a long time. In Paris that evening, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received a telephone call from General Jodl at OKW. Jodl presented the situation with military precision. The beachhead was established across all 5 sectors. Armored counterattacks had been broken by Allied air power. The Atlantic Wall in its northern sector had ceased to function as a coherent defensive line. The situation was, as best it could be described in the language of operational reports, irreversible. Then Jodl asked a question that no military briefing is designed to produce. He asked von Rundstedt what should be done. Von Rundstedt was 68 years old. He had fought in 2 world wars. He had served the Prussian army before any of this existed, before the flags and the speeches and the catastrophe that had been building for a decade and had now arrived at its logical point. He had believed, with the conviction of a man trained in one of history's most effective military traditions, that his doctrine was correct. He had argued against Rommel, he had trusted the reserve, he had believed that armor properly held and properly timed could drive any invasion back into the sea. He looked at the map, he did the calculation, he had been wrong about the strategy, he saw that completely without the ability to soften it. And the man who had been right was standing in a headquarters on the Norman coast, having arrived too late to change anything that mattered. Von Rundstedt gave Jodl his answer. Makes peace, you fool. 4 words. The kind of sentence that sounds, in the moment of it speaking, like the sudden release of something that has been under pressure for a very long time. The most senior field marshal in the Western, the embodiment of 50 years of professional military service. He had looked at the numbers and run the logic to its end, the way any honest professional soldier runs logic to its end when the numbers are what they are, and he had arrived at the only conclusion available. The sentence traveled through a telephone line from Paris to Bavaria and arrived at OKW with the weight of a man saying exactly what he meant. Hitler did not make peace. He issued orders: no retreat, stand fast, die in place. The orders that would hold German units in exposed positions while Allied forces curved around them. The orders that would, in 2 months, produce a place in the Norman countryside called the Falaise Pocket, where an entire German army group was caught on the roads of a narrow valley and taken apart by artillery and aircraft until the roads were not roads anymore. The men who had stood in their bunkers on the night of June 5th, writing letters, drinking coffee, going to sleep in the certainty that the storm was protection, would end their journey there, in a field in France, in a prison camp somewhere in England or America, in the wreckage of a vehicle on a road that had nowhere left to go. On the beach at Omaha, as the sun went down on June 6th, Heinrich Sevelow and the surviving soldiers of WN-62 had already pulled back from their position. The Americans were on the beach, they were on the bluffs above it, they were pushing inland. He looked back once from higher ground in the last light of the evening. The beach he had watched for months, in every kind of weather, in every kind of quiet, was unrecognizable. Equipment met the machinery of an army that had arrived and did not intend to leave. Above the sand, where the beach met the first rise of the bluff, an American flag. He put his hand in the pocket of his field jacket, closed his fingers around something. He had picked up a handful of Normans some soil at some point during the day, sometime in the hours of the battle, without consciously deciding to. He did not know exactly why. He could not have explained it if someone had asked him. He was 18 years old, standing on a hill in occupied France at the end of the longest day of his life, holding a fistful of dirt from a beach where something irreversible had just happened. He kept it. At his headquarters south of Saint-Lô, General Erich Marx sat down in the early hours of June 7th and filed the after-action report that military procedure required. The document that survives in the records of the LXXIV Corps is written in the precise, controlled language of a German staff officers. Unit designations, positions lost and forces engaged. It reads, the way military documents always read, as if the events described were a problem that could be analyzed and from which lessons might eventually be extracted. Near the end of the report, one sentence: Allied forces have established a beachhead across all landing sectors. Armored reinforcement has not arrived in sufficient strength. 23 words. The entire weight of June 6th, 1,944, compressed into operational language. He would not write another. On June 12th, 6 days after his 53rd birthday, his staff car was caught on an open stretch of road by Allied aircraft. The general who had stood at his maps in the first minutes of the invasion and understood with a clarity that came from Trainingspeak and experience and a map exercise in May that had shown him exactly how this ended, what was happening and what could not be done about it, did not survive the month in which the beachhead he had failed to hold began to break open the continent of Europe. Rommel would write to Hitler in the weeks that followed with a directness that very few men in Germany had the standing or the nerve to use. He told the Führer that the military situation in the West was beyond recovery, that the troops were fighting bravely as they always fought, but that courage was not a substitute for air power or subtiotins or armor that could operate in daylight without being destroyed. The war in the West had reached a conclusion that no volume of additional sacrifice would reverse. He was telling Hitler what von Rundstedt had already said on the telephone in 4 words the night of June 6th. The language was more measured. The conclusion was identical. Hitler answered these assessments the way a man answers information that threatens the story he is telling himself. He issued more orders. The stand-fast orders continued. The men who had held the wall held it until the wall was gone, and then they were inside a closing circle, and then the circles closed. The Atlantic Wall had not been stormed, it had been exposed, the invasion had not demolished a fortress, it had walked through a facade held together by concrete and propaganda and the absolute certainty of men who had been told it would hold, who had believed it would hold, who had gone to sleep in their bunkers on a stormy night in early June because every piece of information available to them said they had time. They did not have time. In all of it, in the whole cascading failure of that day, in the arguments and to the absences, and the phone calls that went unanswered, and the orders that never came, one thing stood clear. Rommel had been right about the beaches, right about the first 24 hours, right about air power, and armor, and the narrow window that would open once and would not open again. The man who had been right was in a car in Germany when it happened. He had a pair of shoes in the back seat. His wife's birthday was June 6th. The invasion had already left England before he reached home. It was already crossing the dark water. It was already coming. And not one person who could have stopped it was awake.